I froze when I saw my wife toasting and smiling with another man at the company couple's dinner, so I walked over to them, looked her straight in the eye, and, in a firm voice, wished them both a good dinner before leaving forever. She tried to reach me, but it was too late. Too late. The word that hammered in my mind like a broken bell amid the silence of an empty cathedral. Too late for apologies, too late for regret, too late for us. It wasn't her look that destroyed me, it wasn't the crooked smile trying to feign surprise or the awkward gesture of hiding the hand holding the glass. It was the fact that, for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, she forgot I existed. That I was there, present, as I always had been. That I was the man she claimed to love, protect, and choose every day. And yet, there she was, toasting with another, smiling with another, opening up to another. As if everything else were disposable. As if I were. In the days that followed, I discovered he had disappeared. He said he didn't want anything serious, that it had all been a mistake, that she had confused gambling with love, flirting with promise, adventure with home. And there, in that self-created void, for the first time, she understood what it meant to be alone. Me. I rebuilt my life calmly, unhurriedly, like someone reassembling the shards of an old vase that held flowers that no longer exude any fragrance. I met someone. A sincere gaze, a welcoming silence, a presence that doesn't weigh down. And little by little, without demanding space, this new woman reminded me how good it was to be loved without having to beg, without needing to be vigilant, without fear of being betrayed at any moment by a mistake disguised as a distraction. Months later, she reappeared. With red eyes and a trembling voice. She said she regretted it every day, that she would give anything to go back in time, that she didn't know what she was doing. That she traded the essential for the ephemeral, that she lost herself in a need that only existed because she herself created it. She asked me for forgiveness. Sincerely. With tears that didn't seem forced. And I, contrary to what I thought I would, forgave her. Without shouting, without revenge, without eternal hurt. The pain was still there, of course. But the hurt, that I had already left behind. The love. It wasn't the same anymore. It was a beautiful memory that hurt to remember. And I made it clear, looking into her eyes, that we would never be a couple again. That it wasn't about hate, but about not fitting in anymore. She understood. Maybe not completely. But she understood enough. What she didn't expect, and neither did I, was what came next. The truth is, life has a cruel way of teaching us the value of the choices we make. She lost more than one marriage. She lost the peace of knowing she was loved unconditionally. She lost the only person who saw even the parts of her she hid. She lost the respect of those who rooted for us. And what hurt most, she lost herself. Because after a heart that only wanted to be a home is broken, there's no mirror that shows us whole. She tried to move on. She tried new encounters, old friendships, desperate attempts to reconnect with the version of herself that existed when she was still mine. But nothing worked. Time, which was supposed to heal, only increased the echo of loss. On my side, the pain became a memory. The memory became a lesson. And the lesson became history. And the new story I began was made of care, respect, and admiration. It wasn't a replacement. It was a fresh start, like someone who moves to a new city, taking their luggage with them, but learning new paths. And every time she tried to return, even with sweet words and humble gestures, I encountered an invisible wall I could no longer break down. Because forgiveness is not synonymous with return. And love, even when sincere, dies when stabbed. One day, something unexpected happened. Her mother, who always looked at me with a certain disdain, with a silent, critical look as if I were never good enough for her daughter, came to me. Alone, embarrassed, with her eyes downcast. And she said something that froze me again, but in a completely different way. She said she had never seen her daughter so alive as when she was with me. She said she regretted never appreciating who I was. And, in a whisper that seemed heavier than a scream, she confessed that her daughter had lost the only man who truly respected her. And in that moment, I realized that the most painful karma wasn't loneliness. It was the belated recognition. It was having to hear from her own mother what she herself had denied her entire life. It was knowing that the world didn't forget. That even those who couldn't see before now see. That the love she destroyed wasn't just any love. It was rare. It was unique. And it was mine. She looked at me sometimes, as if still trying to find a loophole in the past. But what she didn't know, or maybe she knew and just didn't want to accept, was that I was no longer there. I was truly gone. Not on the day of the dinner. But much later. When I realized she would never be the same. And neither would I. When I realized that love doesn't survive on apologies, nor on beautiful memories. And that even though I still had affection, respect, and even some tenderness for her, that trust had died. And with it, our story. Now she lives in an eternal what if. I live in a full present. She, silently, carries a past that will never return. I, peacefully, build a future she will never know. And perhaps the most tragic thing about all this is not the end, but the fact that the end was chosen by her before she even realized it had begun. But there's something even she doesn't know, a buried detail, a decision made the exact moment I turned my back at that dinner. Something that changed the course of everything, long before the words of forgiveness, long before the loneliness weighed on her, long before she understood that true love cannot be betrayed with impunity. And when this comes to light, when the truth is finally revealed, it will be impossible not to ask yourself. If she had known this before, would she have done things differently? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, because the betrayal destroys lives, families, and true loves. Our goal is to show, through each storyline, how one wrong choice can cost everything. Get ready now to hear a story intense, exciting and shocking. Take a deep breath, the truth will hurt. They met on an ordinary afternoon, like so many others who cross paths without any idea they were about to embark on something life-changing. His name was Daniel. Hers was Emily. They were in their early 30s when their worlds collided in a quiet coffee shop, the kind of place where time seems to slow down for a few minutes, just long enough for eyes to meet and something inside makes more sense than before. Emily was analytical, rational, extremely controlled in everything that involved her life, from her career to her relationships. She planned. Always planned. Every step, every relationship, every goal. She grew up surrounded by veiled demands and a critical mother who never showed overt affection. The need to be impeccable became part of her identity. Daniel was the opposite, spontaneous, sensitive, calm. He had a lightness in his smile that seemed unfamiliar to her. And it was precisely this lightness that attracted her. He didn't seem to want to fix her, nor impress her, he just listened attentively, as if nothing else was important during those conversations that became frequent. The beginning was light, almost naive. And perhaps that's what made Emily, for the first time in years, feel safe enough to let her guard down. Over time, the two of them developed a silent, profound routine, full of details that escaped the eyes of others. Daniel remembered the way she preferred her coffee, unsweetened, with a dash of cinnamon. Emily, even so rational, learned to observe his silences, and it was in them that she began to understand that love could also be simple, without grand displays or unattainable promises. It was the daily presence, the constant care, the touch on the shoulder at the right time, the note left on the mirror before leaving for work. Emily, who had always prioritized performance and results, began to discover the delicacy of the bond, of the love that didn't demand, but offered. The marriage came naturally. It wasn't impulsive, nor grandiose. It was coherent, as if it were just another step in something that existed long before it was named. They lived in an airy apartment with white walls and hand-selected paintings. Every corner of the house told a part of their story. On weekends, they enjoyed going for walks around the city or taking long grocery runs at local stores. They shared a playlist, favorite movies, and never-ending series. Emily loved how Daniel made her mornings less dreary and how he made a point of listening to her, even when the topic was trivial. Daniel, in turn, admired her strength, her practical intelligence, and the sense of responsibility she maintained even in the face of chaotic situations. During the first few years, they rarely argued. When they did, it was respectful and, almost always, with a desire to resolve the issue. There were no games, no manipulation, at least not consciously. Emily was still extremely controlling in some ways, and Daniel sometimes kept quiet when he wanted to speak, afraid of displeasing. But even with these subtle imbalances, there was love. A real love, built every day, not just felt. Their professional lives were also evolving. Emily was a project manager at a multinational company, organized, efficient, and respected. Daniel worked in systems development and led a small team. They had intense routines, but knew how to find each other in the spaces between commitments. On Tuesdays, they cooked together. On Thursdays, they reserved the evening to avoid talking about work. These small pacts kept their bond strong, even in the midst of the rush. There were plans, future trips, perhaps children, or perhaps not, it wasn't yet decided. But the idea of a shared future never left the forefront. Despite this, something began to change. Small, almost imperceptible. It wasn't all at once, nor was it due to a lack of love. Perhaps it was fatigue, routine, or the illusion that love is indestructible. Emily started coming home later, always with a plausible excuse. Daniel didn't question it, he trusted. And trust, in this case, was silently feeding a chasm. Small distances began to appear, a glance that lasted less, a conversation interrupted by a cell phone, an absence that hadn't existed before. Daniel noticed, but refused to believe it was anything serious. I thought it was a phase. That she was just more pressured with work. That it would pass. Emily, on the other hand, was beginning to feel restless. She didn't know exactly what was missing, but something inside her felt incomplete. Perhaps too much stability, perhaps a secret desire to feel something different, new, uncontrollable. Something she had never allowed herself to feel. There was no heartbreak. Just a growing emptiness with no clear explanation. Silently, she began to distance herself from Daniel, not physically, but emotionally. She began to suppress thoughts, hide insecurities, disguise feelings. And he, as always, respected her space, thinking he was being understanding, when in fact, he was being excluded. The conversations changed in tone. They were no longer long or deep. Dinners became less frequent. The laughter diminished. There was still affection, of course. But there was no longer any urgency, nor that silent vibration between them. It was as if the relationship was alive, but dormant. And no one said it out loud. They just carried on, as if they knew something was wrong but pretended it wasn't serious. Those around them still saw them as the perfect couple. And, in a way, they still were. They had mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and knew how to care for each other. But there was a shadow hanging over them. A silent doubt that Emily carried without admitting. Daniel sensed it, but wouldn't name it. Perhaps out of fear of hearing the truth. An invitation to a couple's dinner at Emily's company arrived on a Friday afternoon. Daniel, as always, accepted with ease. It wasn't his favorite type of event, but he insisted on accompanying her. He knew how much she valued his presence at these times. Emily hesitated for a few seconds before confirming his attendance. It was quick, imperceptible. But that brief second revealed more than any sentence. And Daniel, for the first time, felt something strange. A feeling in his stomach, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. On the day of the event, she was stunning. She wore a dress he couldn't remember seeing before. She was more vain, more perfumed, more present than in recent months. But not to him. It was as if she were preparing to be seen by other eyes. Daniel noticed, but preferred to compliment her. He told her she was beautiful. She smiled, thanked him, but quickly looked away. That night would mark something inside him. Not because of anything she said, but because of what she didn't say. Because of the way she seemed more alive among the others than beside him. Throughout the night, conversations with the other couples were common. They laughed, toasted, and exchanged stories. Emily seemed lighter than she had been in a long time. Daniel watched everything with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. He sensed something in the air, but he couldn't yet pinpoint what it was. He only knew that this night would leave its mark. On the way home, the silence between them was thick. She talked about her projects, the compliments she'd received, the conversations they'd had. Daniel listened, smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. Something was wrong, but he couldn't yet pinpoint what. That night, as she lay down, Emily rolled onto her back more quickly than usual. And Daniel took longer than usual to fall asleep. The love was still there. But something had changed. An invisible line was forming between them. And neither of them yet knew what that line meant. But they knew, deep down, that they were no longer in the same place. And that was just the beginning. In the week following that couple's dinner, Daniel began to notice details he'd previously ignored. Not out of suspicion, but instinct. Like someone who smells smoke before seeing the flames. Emily seemed more restless than usual, talking a lot but saying little. There was a rush in her gestures, as if time were suffocating her, as if she were constantly trying to get ahead of something. Daniel observed silently, as he always did. He wasn't the kind of man to scroll through his phone, email, or social media. His love had always translated into trust, and that trust, until then, had seemed unshakable. But something had changed. It was no longer a diffuse unease, it was a strange presence between them, invisible but constant. Emily, on the other hand, was experiencing a conflict that even she couldn't decipher. The gesture that began as curiosity became habit, and then became desire. There was no plan for it, no real justification, just an impulsive surrender to a feeling that made her feel alive. Her contact with that other man, a colleague from the company's marketing department, began with trivial exchanges, smiles in the hallways, jokes about the boss, and quick coffees. He was witty, confident, with the demeanor of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. And Emily, in her confusion, felt chosen again. She wanted to feel desired, even though she already was. She wanted to play the game of seduction, even though she already had a solid love at home. It was an escape. Not from marriage, but from herself. Their meetings began to happen after hours. Weekday breakfasts, a glass of wine at a secluded bar, a touch that crossed the line into friendship. Everything was unhurried, with the caution of someone who knew they were treading on dangerous ground. But the attraction grew like a flame fueled by the wind. Emily, even though she carried a silent guilt, slowly surrendered. He didn't talk about Daniel with the other man, as if ignoring him would be enough to erase him from the equation. At home, he kept his routine almost intact. He continued his schedules, his rituals, his care. Daniel noticed her mental absences, her evasive answers, the way she averted her eyes when he spoke of something deeper. But he preferred to remain silent. Until then, everything was still uncertain. And doubt, for those who love, is always more bearable than certainty. One particular Saturday marked the beginning of the end. Daniel had prepared breakfast calmly, as he did on weekends. Toast, cut fruit, fresh juice. Emily came down from her room in a hurry, saying she had to go out to meet a friend, that it would be a quick affair. She didn't sit down, didn't have breakfast. He insisted, offering some time for the two of them, a walk. She refused. He said she'd be back early. But she only returned late in the afternoon, with tired eyes and a strange smell on her neck, not of men's cologne, but of a different environment. A smell of a place that wasn't theirs. And for the first time, Daniel felt angry. Not at the possibility of what she might be doing, but at her indifference. At the coldness with which she touched him, as if affection were an obligation. He said nothing that day. He kept it to himself, as he always did. But that night, the insomnia was relentless. Emily began to be more absent. She took calls in another room, left work early, and returned late. When Daniel asked, she explained it matter-of-factly, as if he were exaggerating. But her voice trembled as she responded. One day, he arrived home early, by surprise. He found the room spotless, the house silent. Entering the living room, he saw her unlocked phone on the table. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But a different impulse took hold of him. He tapped the screen, and the message was there, visible, unfiltered. Today was incredible. I can still taste your kiss. Daniel read it once, twice. As if his brain needed to repeat it to believe it. There was no name. But it wasn't necessary. That was enough. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't throw anything on the floor, he didn't cry. He sat on the couch and stayed there for a time he couldn't quite measure. When she arrived, she found him sitting, staring into space. She tried to smile, asked if everything was okay. He said yes. She asked how his day was. She lied. And he just listened. That night, they didn't sleep together. She claimed a headache and went to her room early. Daniel stayed in the living room until dawn, trying to find a way not to explode. Trying to understand when the woman he loved had become someone else. Or worse, if she had always been like this, and he had never seen it. In the days that followed, something inside him began to prepare for the truth. He began to organize his feelings like someone packing up their life for a move. I still didn't know what I would do, but I knew I couldn't go on. What held him back was no longer love. It was the weight of everything they had built. It was the memory of the good days, the conversations in the car, the laughter shared on ordinary nights. It was the memory of who she was before everything was lost. Emily, in turn, began to feel the weight of duplicity. The other man no longer offered the same excitement as before. And Daniel, silent, became a mirror of her mistake. He didn't confront her, but looked at her with a pain so pure it left her disconcerted. One night, they tried to talk. He asked bluntly if something was going on. She denied it. Her voice firm, her eyes fixed. She lied as if to protect herself. But Daniel no longer believed her. He no longer needed confirmation. He already knew. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, being certain and yet wishing it were a lie. The invitation came for another dinner. This time, it would be at an elegant restaurant, closed to company clients. Daniel hesitated to go. Emily insisted, saying he should accompany her. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was a desire to keep up appearances. He accepted. They arrived together, as always. But something had changed between them, and it was evident. Emily seemed restless, looking around as if searching for something. Daniel observed her every gesture, every held breath, every attempt to appear natural. When he returned from the bathroom, he saw from afar. Emily was standing, leaning against the counter, talking to a man. It was the same man from the messages, Daniel couldn't be sure, but her body spoke volumes. She smiled differently. She smiled like she hadn't smiled at him in a long time. The man lightly touched her arm, and she didn't flinch. On the contrary, she moved closer. And in that moment, everything made sense. Daniel took a deep breath and walked toward them, steady and unhurried. Emily saw him coming and froze. The other man did too. Daniel looked at them both, keeping his gaze calm but firm. He said, in a low but unwavering voice, that he wished them both a pleasant dinner. Emily tried to touch him, tried to say something. But he had already turned his back. That night, when he closed the door for the last time, Daniel didn't take his suitcases. He took silence, dignity, and a broken heart. But there was something she didn't know yet. Something that was about to come to light. Something that would transform her regret into something much deeper. A truth that would change everything. Emily spent weeks immersed in the silence she left behind. She tried to move through the days as if they weren't weighing on her shoulders, but everything around her seemed burdened with absence. It wasn't just Daniel's absence in the apartment, it was his absence inside her. Everything felt gray and disconnected, as if the air had changed weight, as if the morning light had lost its color. The other man, the one who seemed to have ignited something dormant in her chest, disappeared like a shadow in the mist. He left no trace, no promises, no explanations. It was a void in the form of a memory, and at the same time, proof that illusion takes its toll in silence. Emily clung to internal justifications that tried to lessen her guilt, but none of them lasted more than a few minutes. Deep down, she knew she had lost much more than a husband. She had lost a home. The first time she tried to call Daniel, it went straight to voicemail. She sent short, not quite desperate messages, still too proud to undress completely. No response. A few days later, she tried to pass by his place of work, disguising her intention of seeing him. But he didn't show up. She felt invisible in a world that kept spinning, as if her mistake were an irreversible point in time. Until, a month after their separation, she decided to go see him. She knew where he was living, a temporary apartment, rented for a few months, according to acquaintances. Daniel answered the door calmly, no anger in his eyes, no haste in his gestures. Emily swallowed hard when she saw him. He was different, firmer, quieter, more in control. He was the same man, but he wasn't the same with her anymore. She tried to smile, but his face didn't respond. She asked to talk, and he nodded and invited her in. They sat in a small, unadorned room, with its makeshift furniture. It was a place for a new beginning. Emily felt her throat tighten as she realized that, in this new home, there was no longer room for her. She began to speak hesitantly. She told him she regretted it, that she had made a mistake, that she had confused her feelings, that she had been weak. She said she knew she might not deserve anything, but she needed to apologize. That it wasn't fair for him to carry the pain of something she had caused alone. Daniel listened silently, his eyes fixed on her, but without judgment. When she finished, he took a deep breath. He said he had gone through all the phases, the anger, the pain, the denial, the despair, but that now he only felt peace. He said he didn't hate her, that he didn't wish her any harm. That he understood, to some extent, what had happened. But that he was already in another place within himself. Emily cried. And in that cry, there was no longer any pride. Only regret. She said she still loved him. That even if he didn't want to anymore, she needed to say it. Daniel stood, walked to the window, and remained silent for a few seconds. When he turned, there was something different in his expression. Something he hadn't yet revealed. Emily noticed. And that was when he began to speak, his voice firm but choked. He said he hadn't looked for her, hadn't answered, hadn't screamed, because he was afraid of what might happen if he did. That he spent nights trying to understand how something so solid could crumble like that. That he replayed the moments, the signs, the small omissions, trying to pinpoint the exact point where everything began to crumble. And then, with his eyes fixed on her, he said something he'd never told anyone. He told her that the week before that fateful dinner, he'd ordered a special gift for her. A necklace with a small blue stone, the same color as the dress she wore on their first date. He'd planned to give it to her that night, at the company dinner, because he wanted to rekindle something between them. He wanted to remind her of who they were. But he'd changed his mind when he saw her smile for another man. Emily's eyes widened, choked. Daniel continued. He said that that same week he had received an unexpected call. Emily's mother. She wanted to meet him. They said they talked for hours. And that, for the first time, the woman who had always treated him coldly acknowledged that he was the best her daughter had ever had. That he had never seen Emily as serene as in the years she had spent with him. And then, in a moment of profound honesty, his mother confided something that would transform everything Emily thought. Daniel looked her in the eye and revealed that her mother knew about the betrayal. She knew even before he did. Emily was paralyzed. She couldn't understand. He explained that his mother, upon hearing gossip at work, from colleagues, glances, whispers, understood what was happening and went to him. Not to tell him in anger, but to prevent him from finding out the hard way. But when she reached him, she found a man still planning to win her daughter back. And that broke her heart. Emily was pale, her hands trembling. She was trying to process everything. The betrayal was already a wound. But knowing that her own mother had sought out the man she had betrayed, to defend him, to protect him from herself, was like a sentence of condemnation that even she couldn't argue with. Daniel said that, in that moment, he understood there was nothing left to save. Because if even her mother, who had never approved of him, had changed sides, it was because the fall had been too deep. Emily put her hand over her mouth, trying to hold back tears. She asked why he hadn't told her sooner. Daniel replied that it was no use. That night, at dinner, he understood everything he needed. And that since then, he no longer saw her as his wife, but as a reminder of what love can be, and what it can become when betrayed. The revelation left Emily devastated. There was no defense, no escape, no distraction. Her betrayal was so grave that it even rebuilt the relationship between her and her mother, placing her, for the first time, on the opposite side. Daniel approached, held her hands for a brief moment. He said he forgave her. That he didn't want to live with anger, that he didn't want to carry that burden forever. But between forgiveness and returning, there was an ocean. And that he was already on the other shore. Emily wept, no longer trying to hide it. There was nothing more she could say. And in that heavy silence, as she relived every step that had led her there, Daniel opened the door. Not with contempt, but with peace. Like someone closing a story knowing they did everything they could. And Emily, as she walked through that door, knew she would never get back what she lost. Because sometimes, the real punishment isn't being left. It's realizing too late the value of someone who's no longer waiting. Emily left the apartment with slow steps, her eyes heavy, as if each tear shed carried the weight of years, not just months. The street seemed too long, cars passed like shadows, and people became indifferent silhouettes. She felt like an isolated point in a universe where everything went on its own, except her. For days, she couldn't look at her own reflection without feeling ashamed, and there was no mirror that showed her anything she recognized. The apartment where she lived with Daniel was exactly the same curtains, the same paintings, the same marks on the sofa. But everything was different. The place that had once been home now felt like a silent reminder of everything she had lost. Each room was a silent judgment, and the time within those walls weighed like a sentence. Her mother's estrangement happened naturally. Emily didn't have the courage to reach out to her. She didn't know what to say, nor how to face the fact that, in the end, the woman she believed incapable of showing affection had done so, but not for her. The betrayal wasn't just against Daniel. It was against their history, against herself, against the only version of herself that truly deserved to be remembered. The days dragged by, dull, aimless. She tried to stay busy at work, but her productivity was declining. She arrived at meetings distracted, forgot deadlines, lost focus. The image she had always maintained of a firm, determined woman began to crumble. Her colleagues' gazes were silent, but they spoke. The reputation she had built with so much effort now seemed fragile, almost forgotten. One Sunday morning, she woke with the feeling that something needed to change. She got out of bed like someone emerging from a shipwreck. She took a leisurely shower, put on light clothes, and, for the first time in weeks, went out aimlessly. She walked for hours, went into a bookstore, then a florist. She bought flowers that Daniel usually placed in the living room, perhaps in an attempt to revive the impossible. When she returned, she found an envelope in the lobby. No return address. It was a letter. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's. The paper trembled in her hands as she opened it, already expecting anything but what was to come. The letter was short. Her mother said she wouldn't write to accuse or console. She wrote because she needed to say something Emily might never understand on her own. The cruelest regret is the one that comes after losing someone who would continue fighting for you, if only they'd given you the slightest response. She said the respect she'd come to feel for Daniel only emerged when she saw his silence in the face of the scandal. And that the way he decided to leave, without destroying, without spreading venom, was more dignified than any reaction she'd ever witnessed. She concluded by saying she hoped Emily would one day understand that love doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't drag on. It just goes. And when it goes, it doesn't come back. Emily read the letter 3 times. Then she left the flowers in the center of the room and decided she could no longer live as if she were the same person. She cut her hair, changed the clothes in her closet, and took old photos out of their frames. She began to shed material memories, not as a way to forget, but as an attempt to rebuild herself. She went to therapy, resumed writing, a habit she had abandoned years ago, and began taking long walks alone. It was a silent but necessary solitude. For the first time, she faced what she had become, without distractions, without excuses. Meanwhile, Daniel was taking his own steps, far away. He was living in a new apartment, small but comfortable. He'd started running again in the late afternoons, something he'd stopped doing since his wedding. He reconnected with old friends, traveled alone for 3 weeks along the coast, took photos, read books, and watched movies that had been on his list for years. He didn't talk about Emily, didn't harbor hatred or resentment. He simply remembered her as a part of his life that, although painful, also shaped him. He wasn't looking for relationships, but he was open to whatever might come. And it was on a Saturday afternoon, at a street fair, that he met Lara. She sold hand-painted paintings and had a light, direct, and honest manner. The conversation started off unpretentiously, but the connection was quick. There were no games, no pretensions. And perhaps that's why he let her in. Lara was different from Emily in every way. She was intense, but not dramatic. Sincere to the point of disconcerting, and calm, as someone who knows their own worth. With her, Daniel didn't need to explain himself or ask for space. She noticed his silences, but didn't fill them with assumptions. She just was. And, little by little, Daniel began to breathe more easily. He felt seen. Respected. Loved, but undemanding. Months passed. Emily and Daniel didn't cross paths. Until fate, as always merciless and opportune, brought them face to face. It was the wedding of a mutual friend, one of those who stood in the middle of the abyss, without taking sides. Both were invited. And both decided to go. Emily arrived first, wearing a discreet dress, her hair tied back, her posture controlled. Daniel appeared later, hand in hand with Lara. And in that moment, seeing him enter with another woman, Emily felt something she had never felt before. It wasn't jealousy. It was a specific kind of pain, a deep recognition that there was something there that had once been hers, but was now no longer. She observed discreetly. She noticed how naturally he touched Lara, how she looked at him with affection. There was love there. And worst of all, it was light. It was true. During the party, Emily tried to keep her distance. She avoided eye contact. But at one point, they passed each other in the hallway leading to the restrooms. They stood face to face for a few seconds too long. Daniel smiled slightly, politely. She returned it. They exchanged a nearly silent greeting. And she, unable to contain herself, said she was happy to see him well. Daniel thanked her sincerely. And before leaving, she asked if she could, someday, invite him for coffee. Not as an attempt to win her back, but as someone who needs closure. He hesitated for a second, looked back to where Lara was waiting for him, smiling, then said yes. But perhaps that coffee was just to confirm what they both already knew. The meeting took place 2 days later. In a discreet corner cafe, without many people. They talked for almost an hour. Emily talked about the process of starting over, the pain, the guilt, the discoveries. Daniel said little, but listened attentively. And when she thanked him for always being honest, he smiled and said that she had been too, as far as she could. And that not every mistake is born of malice. Sometimes it's born of the cowardice of not facing what one feels. Emily agreed. And at the end, as they said goodbye, she asked if he still believed in love. He said yes. But that he now knew that true love doesn't tolerate doubt for long. Because where there is too much doubt, there is room for absence. And where there is absence, another love arrives and fills it. They hugged. Not as if they wanted to get back together, but as if they needed to say goodbye properly. And in that embrace, there was no resentment. Only maturity. Emily left the cafe certain that sometimes life doesn't offer second chances with the same person. But it does offer the chance to be someone better. And Daniel, upon returning home and seeing Lara reading a book on the porch, understood that what he had experienced with Emily was important, but what he had now was what he truly deserved. And they never looked back. After that silent coffee, filled with everything that could no longer be said without hurting what still held esteem between them, Emily and Daniel went their separate ways. Their final embrace wasn't a fresh start, nor a spiteful goodbye, it was, in fact, a mature acceptance that some stories end not for lack of feeling, but for too much consequence. And it was in that mutual silence, heavy and serene at the same time, that a new kind of bond was formed between them, the recognition of the love that once was, but now no longer fit into the real lives of either of them. Time, always so relentless when one tries to go back, now seemed kind, as if offering them both the chance to reorganize their pain into wisdom. Emily began to fill her days with new purposes. If before she sought distractions to keep herself afloat, now she made conscious choices to build something that made sense, even if everything seemed smaller without the previous weight. She signed up for courses, restructured her work rhythm, reconnected with old friends, and, little by little, also began rebuilding the bridge with her mother, albeit with timid steps. There were no long or dramatic conversations between them, but rather small gestures, a lunch prepared for no reason, a note left on the table, a sudden visit. Gradually, they grew closer through what they had lost in common, their admiration for a man who, at different times, had touched each of them with a generosity that neither of them knew how to fully reciprocate in time. Emily now understood that regret isn't just an emotion. It's a mirror. A constant reflection that stands between her and the world. When she looked at herself, she saw the woman she had been, and the woman she was still trying to become. And between these two images, there was a gap that no one else could fill, only she, with real actions, with choices that didn't seek to fix the past, but to prevent it from happening again. For the first time in a long time, she stopped punishing herself and started taking responsibility. Because punishment is external, but responsibility is internal. And this transition hurt. But it was necessary. On the other side, Daniel lived a different reality. His relationship with Lara had evolved into something solid, yet light. There was no pressure for what was, nor constant vigilance about what would be. With her, he felt understood without needing to explain too much. The silence between them was comfortable, not suffocating. Mornings were shared calmly, plans came slowly, without anxiety. And even without saying it out loud, they both knew they were building something that deserved to last, not because it was perfect, but because it was sincere. Lara, noticing the spaces of silence Daniel still harbored, never tried to invade them. She simply stayed close, offering presence rather than demanding. And this quiet maturity allowed Daniel to finally look forward without carrying the constant weight of looking back. There was, however, a dilemma that still weighed heavily on both of their shoulders. Emily, now in a deep process of self-discovery and reparation, began to get involved in social initiatives, mentoring, and emotional support projects for women going through separation, loss, and rebuilding. She discovered that there was strength in her pain when she put it to work for others. She became an unexpected figure in a circle she never imagined she would be part of. And it was in this new environment that she faced the most difficult of questions: could she, even as someone who had caused pain, still teach us something about love, forgiveness, and starting over? For Daniel, the doubt stemmed not from the present, but from the future. Although happy with Lara, he still carried an unanswered question: what if the experience with Emily had somehow changed his ability to surrender? Had he, in the name of protection, become overly cautious? Was he, even unconsciously, holding himself back from something that could be even greater than what he had before? He no longer wanted to live in fear of loss, but he also didn't want to repeat the naivete that had led him to ignore the signs. It was a delicate balance, and one that required something rare from both of them: vulnerability with no guarantee of return. Emily and Lara's reunion happened in the most unlikely way possible. A cultural event in the city, organized by a network of women artists and entrepreneurs. Emily, now involved in organizing events with social impact, had been invited to open one of the tables. Lara, as a visual artist and guest on one of the panels, was scheduled to exhibit her work. Their names appeared next to each other on the invitations, but neither of them realized it until the day of the event. When they saw each other, there was a moment of awkwardness, but it was interrupted by something greater, a mutual gesture of silent respect. They exchanged no words at that moment, only glances. But both glances carried something that transcended rivalry: understanding. Because both, in very different ways, had met the same man, and both, to different degrees, knew how much that had changed their lives. The week after the event, Emily decided to write a letter. Not to try to rekindle anything, nor to ask for anything. Just to say thank you. For the way Daniel had handled everything. For his dignified silence. For the lack of scandal. For the humanity with which he allowed her to see who she was, without ever holding it against her. The letter was delivered by a mutual friend, hand-delivered, without warning. Daniel read it at home, in silence, as was his custom. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper and tucked it inside a book Emily had given him years before, with a simple inscription: "So that we never lose each other." The irony of the gesture made him smile. But it also made him understand something he had been trying to avoid: that even stories with painful endings can leave chapters worth rereading from time to time, not to want to return, but to remember how much one has grown since then. In the months that followed, life settled into its new shape. Daniel stayed with Lara, now planning to live together, perhaps travel for a few months, and slow down from the routine that had always consumed them. Emily, for her part, decided to move to a new city. A literal fresh start, with fewer visible memories and more space to build new stories without so many echoes of what had happened. When she said goodbye, she received unexpected messages of support, including from people who had previously judged her. Because people, despite everything, still know how to recognize when someone is truly trying to be better than they were. And even as time passed, even as the distance became concrete, there was something that still connected them, not like a thread of hope, but like a scar that no longer hurt, but that would never fade. Emily knew she would never have that love again. Daniel knew he had survived the worst and found something even truer. They had both lost and gained. They had both loved and failed. And now, they carried within them a kind of maturity that only comes when life takes away something essential to force us to find something even deeper. It was the beginning of the end. But at the same time, the end of everything that needed to end so that the true beginning could finally happen. Emily's decision to move wasn't sudden or impulsive. She nurtured this desire over the months like someone tending a silently growing plant, slowly taking root until it no longer fits in the same pot. It wasn't an escape. It was a liberation. She was tired of bumping into her own mistakes every day, materialized in places, streets, people, and smells. She needed fresh air, landscapes that didn't remind her of everything she'd lost. She wanted to rebuild her life without the constant comparison with who she was or what she'd done. She found a small apartment in a smaller city, with less noise and more time. There, she wasn't the ex-wife who cheated, nor the successful professional on the way down. She was simply a woman, trying to find some version of herself still worthy of staying. For the first few days, he immersed himself in the silence he had so avoided before. He didn't rush to tidy up, nor did he try to fill the rooms with objects or distractions. He left the boxes closed for days. He sat on the floor of the empty living room and listened to his own breathing, like someone needing reassurance that he was still alive after a storm. The neighbors were discreet, and that helped. He didn't need to explain anything, he didn't owe anyone stories. He could start from scratch. And that's what he did. She joined a therapeutic writing group and began narrating her journey in short stories, using fictitious names, altered situations, but still with the raw pain intact. The other women in the group identified with her. And, curiously, without knowing who she really was, they admired the way she transformed pain into poetry, how she turned guilt into raw material for something that touched the listener. Gradually, her words ceased to be an internal plea for forgiveness and became bridges. One day, after a particularly intense reading, one of the women in the group, with tears in her eyes, said she recognized herself in the character in Emily's story. But unlike Emily, she hadn't had the courage to admit her mistakes. And now she lived as if she were dead, even though she was breathing. Emily didn't respond immediately. She simply held her hand and smiled with the kind of solidarity that only someone who has reached rock bottom can offer. Meanwhile, Daniel faced an emotional crossroads. His relationship with Lara remained serene, but a new job offer would require a change. It was a big opportunity, with an ambitious project in another country. He hesitated to tell her, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he knew the news would change everything. When he finally shared it with Lara, he expected questions, perhaps some resistance. But she, with her usual calm, simply asked if he wanted to go on his own, or if he was accepting because he was still trying to fill some void. He remained silent. He needed to think. It was a fair and necessary question. In the following days, he pondered everything he had built with her. There were no pressures, and for that very reason, the decision was even more difficult. He faced a real chance to start over in another territory, but also the risk of breaking the only emotional stability he had found after the fall. He eventually decided to accept the proposal. But not in the way he expected. Instead of leaving alone, he invited Lara to go with him. Not as a request for sacrifice, but as a sincere invitation to a new cycle. She accepted, on the condition that everything be done gradually. They sold the few pieces of furniture they had, organized the move, said goodbye to friends. Daniel visited his parents before leaving, reunited with cousins he hadn't seen in years, and talked to his younger brother, who had always looked up to him. For the first time in a long time, he felt complete, not because he was returning to a safe place, but because he had rebuilt his inner security. In her new city, Emily was already beginning to gain recognition for her online writing. A small blog became a welcoming space for hurting, confused people seeking refuge in writing. She didn't use her full name, but her voice still reached hearts. One day, she received an unexpected email. It was from a small but respected publisher, inviting her to participate in a collection with other authors who had transformed real experiences into literature. At first, she hesitated. There was something about sharing her story that still frightened her. But after reflection, she understood that she wasn't exposing her mistake, but rather her process. It was about rebuilding, not falling. She accepted. And for the first time, she saw her name printed in a book. Not as the woman who destroyed her own home, but as someone who learned to build something new from the rubble. A year after his last meeting with Daniel, he and Lara were settled on another continent. The days were different, the schedules too. The language, the customs, everything new. But there was peace. And there was love. A love that didn't need to be greater than the previous one, but was completely different. Daniel, looking at Lara on a Sunday morning, silently making coffee, felt a kind of gratitude that came not with euphoria, but with calm. He was where he wanted to be. And that was enough. Emily, for her part, received invitations to speak, to talk to groups of women in the process of transformation. There was no glamour to it. It was painful to relive it every time she had to open up. But there was a purpose. A cycle. At one of these talks, a young woman approached her after the presentation. She said she was about to cheat on her husband. That she had already passed her emotional limit, but hadn't done anything physical yet. He said that, upon hearing her story, he felt a reality check. And that maybe there was still time to salvage something. Emily didn't tell her what to do. She simply asked the woman to consider whether she was about to cheat on the other person, or on herself. And the young woman cried. Not because of the answer, but because you finally understood the question. The story Emily and Daniel shared hadn't disappeared. It still existed, like a subtle scar, present on specific dates, in smells, in sounds, in inevitable memories. But it no longer hurt. It was part of the baggage, not the weight. And although they would never meet again in person, they still knew of each other through mutual friends, exchanges of news, small traces left in the world. Neither of them wanted to return. Neither of them held a grudge. There was only respect. And the knowledge that not every love that ends is a failure. Some end simply because they no longer fit into the people they've become. In the hallways of her new city, in the cafes where she spent hours with her laptop, Emily sometimes found herself imagining what it would be like to meet Daniel again in the distant future, by chance, in some unusual place. Maybe an airport, a book fair, some random event. She imagined a smile, a wave, maybe even a hug. Not as an attempt at redemption, but as a silent celebration of all they had overcome. And in these brief fantasies, she felt a pang of longing, not for him, but for who she was with him. Because the love they had shared was real. And even though it had been destroyed by her own hands, she now carried it as a living memory. Not as a burden, but as a beacon. An eternal reminder that some choices cannot be undone. But that how you deal with the consequences is what ultimately defines who you decide to be. Time passed with the same discretion with which life changes seasons without warning. 2 years had passed since that last coffee between Emily and Daniel. 2 years in which the paths, already traced in opposite directions, were confirmed as definitive choices. Emily, now 36, no longer lived under the shadow of what she had destroyed, but neither did she deny her own ruins. She learned to live with them. They were there, part of her inner landscape, silently reminding her that every thoughtless act has a price, and sometimes, the price is not being able to return. The once small writing project became a reference for many women. Her story gained strength not through glamour, but through the authenticity of the pain she carried. She had transformed her fall into service. But that didn't redeem her, and she knew it. Life doesn't reward every story of regret with reconciliation. Sometimes, the prize is simply not repeating the mistake. Daniel, on the other hand, was on the eve of a new cycle. He had proposed to Lara on a trip to the Tuscan countryside, and she, with teary eyes and the calm smile of someone who knew the answer even before the question, accepted. It wasn't a hasty decision, nor was it made to fill in the gaps of the past. It was a gesture of maturity, of someone who already knew the pain of betting on love and losing, but still chose to believe. The wedding would be simple, intimate, surrounded only by those who witnessed their rebuilding process. A fresh start without fanfare, but with meaning in every detail. On the eve of the ceremony, Daniel decided to write a letter. Not addressed to anyone specifically, but as an intimate exercise, a ritual. She wrote about the love she believed would last forever but wasn't. About the pain that nearly destroyed him, but which taught him more than any victory. He wrote about Emily, not with resentment, but with an honesty that only time can grant. He recognized that, despite everything, she had been essential in helping him understand that love requires vigilance, care, and that the absence of betrayal is not enough to sustain a relationship, it requires presence, daily choice, emotional loyalty. She tucked the letter between the pages of a book she would take on her honeymoon. Not out of longing, but because she needed to close that chapter with the word she'd missed before, gratitude. The same weekend as her wedding, Emily was participating in an international conference on autobiographical literature. Her panel was packed. She received a standing ovation, not for being perfect, but for having the courage to bleed in public without hiding behind excuses. As she was leaving, a woman approached her, emotionally, saying she had left a sham marriage after hearing one of her talks. She said Emily hadn't saved her marriage, but she had saved her dignity. Emily thanked her, and as she got into the ride-hailing car that would take her back to her hotel, she felt a tightness in her chest. It wasn't sadness, nor was it regret. It was simply the realization that, even when we rebuild everything, there are pains that never go away. They just become more silent. At night, alone in her room, she decided to open a folder she'd long avoided. It was the old diary she'd started right after Daniel left. She read a few pages, saw the words of a woman in ruins, confused, trying to stitch together a broken soul with fragile threads. She smiled compassionately. Not because she'd overcome everything, but because she could look at herself without hatred. It was at that moment that her phone vibrated. It was a message from her mother. Short, direct, "Today I thought of you. And of the man you lost. I hope that, one day, your heart finds someone who loves you the way you couldn't recognize before." Emily took a while to respond. Then she simply wrote, "Thank you. I hope so too." The next day, while Daniel and Lara exchanged vows before a small group of loved ones, Emily walked alone along a cliffside trail, where the wind seemed to speak truths she couldn't hear alone. She closed her eyes and, in a symbolic gesture, threw a small chain she'd worn on her wrist for years into the sea. Not as a performative release, but as a silent closure. An end without applause. A goodbye without an audience. Daniel lived that day with a peace he'd never felt before. When he looked into Lara's eyes and pledged his loyalty, it wasn't with fear of the future, but with the relief of finally being in the present. A whole present. Full of meaning. Full of truth. When the ceremony was over, he walked alone for a few minutes to a nearby tree, sat in the shade, and reread the letter he'd written. Then he tore it into pieces and buried it right there, beneath dry leaves. He buried it not out of contempt, but because he knew that what he'd experienced didn't deserve to be ashes. It simply deserved to rest. Emily, some time later, published her first solo book. A novel inspired by her own journey, but transformed by fiction. The book was enthusiastically received by critics. Not as a form of redemption, but as proof that literature is a way to rebuild what reality destroys. She never spoke directly about Daniel again. In interviews, when asked about her inspirations, she would only say that she once loved someone so intensely that she could only move on after losing them. She never revealed names. But those who knew, knew. And that was enough. Fate, as capricious as ever, would bring the two together again, but not in the way movies often portray. One afternoon, in a random airport in a distant country, Daniel came across a poster advertising a lecture on writing from loss. He recognized the author's name. He smiled. And went on his way. Emily, meanwhile, on the other side of the terminal, was staring out the glass window, waiting for her flight. For a moment, she turned back, as if she'd sensed something. But she saw no one she knew. Only hurried passengers coming and going. She adjusted her headphones, opened a new document on her laptop, and began writing the first sentence of her new book. Stories don't need happy endings to be great. They just need truths that endure, even when the protagonists go in different directions. Daniel and Emily were a story. They were love, they were mistakes, they were losses, they were rebuilding. And in the end, they were exactly what they should have been, a lesson for each other. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Have you ever experienced something similar or known someone who has? Leave your comment below, we'd love to hear your opinion. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. There's a lot of powerful stuff coming, and you won't want to miss out. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It breaks bonds, shatters trust, and often rips away the most precious thing in life, true love. Here on the channel, we don't romanticize, justify, or support any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to the truth and to stories that touch, awaken, and teach. Until next time.